In the winter of 1847, something arrived in the remote mountain town of Milbrook, Vermont, that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They called him Samuel Hawthorne, though that name appears nowhere in any official records from before that terrible February night, when he emerged from a blizzard that had claimed 17 lives across Windham County. What the townspeople discovered about this man, who spoke of distant lands beyond the mountains, and demonstrated medical knowledge that saved dozens during a deadly outbreak of winter fever, would shake their faith in human nature itself, and reveal truths about survival that civilized minds refused to accept. For over a century and 70 years, the Milbrook Historical Society has kept certain documents locked away from public view, documents that detail not just who Samuel Hawthorne really was, but what he had done to survive in those frozen peaks, and, more terrifyingly, what he continued to do long after his rescue. The truth about Samuel Hawthorne isn't just a story of survival gone wrong. It's a testament to how far a human being can fall when civilization is stripped away, and how monsters can hide behind the masks of saviors, while slowly converting entire communities to their twisted philosophy of existence. Before we continue with the story of Samuel Hawthorne, and the winter that changed Milbrook forever, make sure to subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one dig deep into America's darkest historical secrets. And tell us in the comments what state you're listening from, because you might be surprised how many similar disappearances happened in your area during those harsh winters of the 1840s. The pattern of mysterious vanishings that followed Samuel Hawthorne's path through New England affected over 60 families across 4 states, and the authorities never connected the dots, until it was far too late. The records I'm about to share with you come from sources that have never been digitized, never been made public, and, for good reason, they contain details about human nature that most people aren't prepared to confront. Milbrook, Vermont, in 1847, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Nestled in a valley between the Green Mountains, roughly 40 miles northeast of Bennington, the town barely scratched 300 souls, most of them farmers, loggers, and their families, trying to make an honest living from unforgiving land. The settlement had been established in 1789 by Revolutionary War veterans seeking cheap land and a fresh start. But by the 1840s, it had become one of those forgotten communities that existed in the gaps between larger towns, connected to the outside world only by treacherous mountain roads that became impossible for months during winter. The winter of 1846 to 1847 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that the town's doctor, Ezekiel Putnam, a Harvard-educated physician who had come to Milbrook in 1843 seeking a simpler life after losing his practice in Boston due to gambling debts, recorded in his journal that whiskey froze solid in bottles left overnight. The Connecticut River, which normally provided the town with fresh water and a route for trade goods, had frozen to a depth of 4 feet by January. Even the hardiest locals, men like Norwegian immigrant Henrik Bergström, who had survived winters in the Arctic Circle, spoke of this season as unlike anything they had experienced. The town's heart was Main Street, a muddy thoroughfare in summer, a frozen wasteland in winter, lined with Jeremiah Prescott's General Store, a 2-story wooden building that served as the community's primary source of supplies and unofficial news center. Prescott, a shrewd merchant who had moved from Connecticut in 1839, kept meticulous records of every transaction, and every piece of gossip that passed through his establishment. His ledgers would later become crucial evidence in understanding the extent of Samuel Hawthorne's influence over the community. The Milbrook Inn, run by the widow Abigail Foresk, stood at the eastern end of Main Street. Mrs. Foresk, whose husband had died in a logging accident 3 years prior, maintained rooms for the occasional travelers who found themselves stranded in Milbrook during their journeys through the mountains. Her inn also served as the town's informal social center, where farmers and loggers would gather on winter evenings to drink corn whiskey, play cards, and share news from the outside world. The modest white church, where Reverend Isaiah Greenfield delivered sermons to increasingly thin congregations, dominated the town square. Greenfield, a stern Congregationalist minister educated at Yale, had arrived in Milbrook in 1844 with dreams of building a strong Christian community in the wilderness. By the winter of 1847, however, his congregation was struggling with doubts that went far deeper than the typical challenges of frontier life. The harsh realities of surviving in such an isolated place were testing everyone's faith in divine providence. Most families lived in simple wooden houses, heated by whatever firewood they could gather before the snows made the forests impossible. The more prosperous residents, like Thomas and Grace Thornberry, who owned the largest farm in the valley, and employed several local men as seasonal workers, had two-story homes with multiple fireplaces and cellars for storing preserved food. The Thornberrys had 3 children, Sarah, 12, already helping with household duties, Mary, 8, known for her bright curiosity about everything around her, and young William, 5, the apple of his mother's eye. By February of 1847, Milbrook was struggling in ways that went beyond the typical hardships of a harsh winter. The community had already lost 5 residents to the cold and disease. Old Henrik Bergstrom, the Norwegian logger who had been found frozen in his cabin after the chimney collapsed during a January blizzard, had been beloved by the children for his stories of trolls and northern lights. Margaret Fairchild's baby had died of pneumonia despite Dr. Putnam's best efforts, leaving the young mother in a state of grief so profound that she barely spoke to anyone anymore. Most concerning was the growing shortage of food and medical supplies. The last supply wagons had arrived in late November, and no one expected any relief until the spring thaw opened the mountain passes. Dr. Putnam's medical supplies were nearly exhausted. He was down to his last bottles of ipecac and quinine, and his surgical instruments were showing signs of wear that made him increasingly anxious about performing even basic procedures. People were beginning to whisper about the cursed winter that seemed to have settled over their small community like a burial shroud, and some of the older residents spoke in hushed tones about abandoning Milbrook entirely when spring arrived. It was into this desperate, isolated world that Samuel Hawthorne emerged from the storm, carrying with him knowledge and supplies that seemed too good to be true. And, as the townspeople would discover, they were. February 18, 1847. The date is burned into the memory of every Milbrook family that survived what came after, recorded not just in Dr. Putnam's medical journals, but in the personal diaries of at least 6 residents who documented the strange events that began that night. Young Timothy Prescott, Jeremiah's 14-year-old son, was the first to spot the figure stumbling down the mountain path in the middle of a blizzard that had already buried 3 feet of new snow in the valley since dawn. The boy had been checking the store's rear windows for ice damage when he saw what looked like a walking corpse, silhouetted against the white fury of the storm. Timothy's first instinct was to dismiss the figure as a hallucination brought on by staring too long into the swirling snow. But as he watched, the shape resolved into unmistakably human form. The figure moved with purpose, following the winding path down from the high peaks with a confidence that seemed impossible in such conditions. Most travelers caught in blizzards wandered randomly, becoming increasingly disoriented until they collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. This person walked as if following a map that only he could see. The boy called for his father, and within minutes, half the men in town had gathered at Prescott's store to watch the stranger's approach. What they saw defied their understanding of what was possible in such weather. The figure walked upright against winds that were bending trees nearly horizontal. His pace was steady, unhurried, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll through pleasant weather, instead of battling conditions that had already killed several travelers that winter. Samuel Hawthorne arrived at death's door, or so it seemed. His clothes were strange, made of materials that folks in Milbrook had never seen before. The outer garment appeared to be a long coat or cloak, fashioned from what looked like treated animal hide, but the texture was unlike any leather the local farmers and hunters recognized. It was thick, almost armor-like in appearance, and seemed to repel snow rather than absorb it. Underneath, he wore what appeared to be layered clothing, made from a tightly woven fabric that looked almost metallic in certain light. His boots were perhaps the most puzzling aspect of his appearance. They were constructed in a way that left peculiar tracks in the snow, deeper than ordinary boots would make, with a distinctive pattern that included what looked like metal studs or spikes arranged in geometric designs. Dr. Putnam later sketched these tracks in his journal, noting they were unlike any footwear manufactured in New England, or any European pattern with which he was familiar. The boots appeared designed specifically for traversing difficult terrain in extreme weather, suggesting a level of craftsmanship and specialized knowledge inconsistent with Hawthorne's claim to come from a simple mountain community. But it was Hawthorne's physical condition that first truly unsettled the townspeople. Despite allegedly wandering through a killing blizzard for what he claimed were many days and nights, he showed none of the signs of severe frostbite that should have claimed his fingers and toes. His cheeks were ruddy with cold, yes, but his extremities were perfectly intact. His movement was fluid and coordinated, and his speech was clear and articulate. Dr. Putnam examined him thoroughly and found this so remarkable that he wrote extensively about it, theorizing that Hawthorne must have had access to shelter and proper supplies far more recently than his story suggested. The man himself was tall and lean, standing well over 6 feet in height, with dark hair that seemed prematurely streaked with white, though he appeared no more than 35 years old. His build suggested someone accustomed to physical labor and harsh conditions. His hands were calloused and scarred, his shoulders broad from years of carrying heavy loads, his legs powerful from walking long distances over difficult terrain. But it was his face that people remembered most clearly. His features were sharp and angular, with high cheekbones and a prominent nose that gave him an almost predatory appearance. His skin was weathered but healthy, with none of the pallor or signs of malnutrition expected from someone surviving in the wilderness. Most memorable were his eyes, a pale blue, almost colorless in certain light, like ice over deep water. The way he looked at people made them deeply uncomfortable, as if he were measuring them for something they couldn't understand. Children found him fascinating, like a dangerous animal that beckoned their curiosity. Adults instinctively felt the need to keep their distance. Several residents later described the unsettling sensation that Hawthorne was cataloging everything he saw, memorizing the layout of their homes, the routines of their families, the relationships and hierarchies within the community. When he spoke, it was in perfect English, but with an accent that no one in Milbrook could place. It wasn't British, despite some similarities in pronunciation. It wasn't German or Scandinavian, though there were hints of those influences. Dr. Putnam, who had traveled extensively before settling in Vermont, described it as an accent that seemed to borrow from many sources while belonging to none. Hawthorne's vocabulary was extensive and precise, suggesting formal education, but he occasionally used words or phrases that seemed archaic, or simply unfamiliar, to his listeners. His story, when he finally told it, was both compelling and deeply unsettling. He claimed to come from beyond the Great Peaks, from valleys where the sun shines differently, and the seasons follow older patterns. When pressed for specifics about this homeland, he would become vague, speaking of "my people," and "the homeland across the white fields, where the old ways still guide the wise." He described a community that lived in harmony with the harshest aspects of nature, where survival depended not on fighting the wilderness, but on understanding its deeper rhythms, and accepting its necessary cruelties. Children found him fascinating, gathering around whenever he spoke to hear stories of distant places and strange customs. Adults found him deeply unsettling, but couldn't articulate why. There was something about the way he moved, the way he observed everything around him, the way his pale eyes seemed to see through people rather than simply looking at them, that triggered instinctive alarm in anyone who spent more than a few minutes in his presence. The most disturbing aspect of Samuel Hawthorne's arrival, however, was what he carried with him. In a leather satchel that never left his side, a bag made from the same strange, weather-resistant material as his clothing, he kept what he called his medicines and tools of survival. The contents of this bag would later become the source of the town's greatest nightmares. But in those first days, desperate as they were for any kind of help, the people of Milbrook welcomed what seemed like divine intervention in their darkest hour. That first night, as Hawthorne sat by the fire in the Milbrook Inn, warming himself with a mug of Mrs. Forrest's strongest coffee, he began to demonstrate the knowledge that would make him indispensable to the community. When young Sarah Thornberry began coughing violently, a symptom that had been growing worse over the past week, and had Dr. Putnam worried about consumption, Hawthorne listened carefully to the sound and immediately diagnosed the problem as a respiratory infection caused by breathing too much smoke from poorly ventilated fireplaces. From his mysterious satchel, he produced a small vial containing a dark liquid that smelled of pine needles and something else, something sweet and organic that no one could identify. He instructed Sarah to take just 3 drops mixed with warm water before bedtime. Within an hour, her coughing had subsided significantly. By morning, she was breathing normally for the first time in weeks. Word of this miraculous cure spread through Milbrook like wildfire, and by the end of Samuel Hawthorne's first full day in town, half the community was lined up outside the inn, hoping for relief from various ailments plaguing them throughout the harsh winter. Within days of his arrival, Samuel Hawthorne had established himself as Milbrook's unofficial second doctor, though his methods were unlike anything the townspeople had ever witnessed. Dr. Putnam, initially skeptical of anyone claiming medical knowledge without formal training, became grudgingly impressed with the stranger's diagnostic abilities and the effectiveness of his treatments. Hawthorne could diagnose ailments at a glance, identifying conditions that had puzzled Putnam for weeks. He knew exactly which herbs to gather, even in the dead of winter, somehow locating medicinal plants buried under feet of snow. And most remarkably, his treatments worked with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. When little Sarah Thornberry developed what Dr. Putnam feared was consumption, the same disease that had killed 3 people in Milbrook the previous winter, Hawthorne prepared a strange concoction. It involved boiling certain roots with what he claimed was preserved meat from mountain game, prepared according to the old traditions of my people. The process took several hours and required ingredients that Hawthorne produced from various containers in his seemingly bottomless leather satchel. The smell that emanated from his cooking pot was unlike anything the townspeople had encountered. Sweet and sickly, with an underlying odor that reminded several residents of the time Henrik Bergstrom's body hadn't been found for nearly a week after his cabin chimney collapsed. Mrs. Forrest, who prided herself on her knowledge of cooking and preserving foods, could not identify any of the scents coming from Hawthorne's preparation. When she asked about his ingredients, he smiled mysteriously. He explained that his people had developed these preservation techniques over many generations of surviving in the harshest mountain conditions. The medicine worked. Sarah recovered completely within 3 days, though she complained of vivid nightmares filled with snow and hungry eyes watching her from dark places. She described dreams of walking through endless white landscapes where shadowy figures called to her in languages she didn't understand, promising warmth and food if she would join them in their sacred feast. Her mother, Grace Thornberry, was so grateful for her daughter's recovery that she insisted Hawthorne stay in their family's spare room above the kitchen, despite her husband Thomas's reservations about hosting a stranger about whom they knew so little. It was Grace who first noticed Hawthorne's peculiar habits and began documenting them in letters to her sister in Albany. Letters that were never sent, but which were preserved in the Thornberry family papers and later provided crucial evidence for investigators. Hawthorne never slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, always with one ear listening, as if expecting something to find him. He would wake several times each night, sitting motionless by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an intensity that made Grace deeply uncomfortable. He would disappear for hours during the worst storms, claiming he needed to gather certain plants and materials for his medicines. These expeditions seemed impossible, given the weather conditions, winds that made it dangerous for even experienced outdoorsmen to venture far from shelter, temperatures that could kill an unprepared person within hours. Yet Hawthorne would return from these mysterious journeys with his strange boots barely wet, carrying items that shouldn't have been available in the Vermont wilderness during winter. Fresh meat was the most puzzling of his acquisitions. While the local hunters hadn't seen game for weeks, surviving on preserved stores from the autumn hunting season, Hawthorne regularly returned with what he claimed were rabbits, deer, and other forest animals. The meat looked fresh and skillfully prepared, cut into precise portions that he claimed reflected traditional methods learned from his people. But several of the more experienced hunters noticed that the cuts didn't look quite right. The bone structure seemed wrong for the animals Hawthorne claimed they came from, and the meat itself had a texture and color unlike local game. Dr. Putnam, whose medical training included anatomy, became increasingly suspicious of Hawthorne's game meat. During one examination of the portions Hawthorne used in his medicines, Putnam noticed cuts that looked remarkably similar to human muscle tissue. When he raised this concern, Hawthorne laughed. "You must understand, Doctor," he said with an unsettling smile, "survival in the true wilderness requires one to abandon the squeamish attitudes of civilized society. My people learned long ago that all meat is essentially the same. It provides the nutrients needed to sustain life, regardless of its original source. The important thing is proper preparation, and the spiritual attitude with which one consumes what nature provides." Grace found him one morning carefully cleaning what appeared to be a woman's silver locket, polishing it with a soft cloth while humming a tune she'd never heard, but which seemed hauntingly familiar. The melody was simple, but deeply unsettling, with a rhythm reminiscent of funeral dirges she had heard as a child. When she asked about the locket, he smiled that same unsettling smile. "It belonged to a dear friend from home," he said, "who couldn't make the journey, but whose spirit travels with me always." But Grace could have sworn she'd seen that exact locket before, around the neck of Rebecca Henley, the wife of merchant James Henley, who had disappeared with her husband during a trip to Albany the previous autumn. The Henleys had been trapped by an early storm in the mountain passes, and despite extensive searches, no trace of them had ever been found. The locket was distinctive, silver, with an intricate floral pattern that Rebecca's grandmother had brought from Ireland. Grace had admired it many times when the Henleys visited Milbrook for supplies. The stranger's room became a source of growing unease for the Thornberry family. Strange sounds emanated from it at night, soft scraping noises, like someone working with small tools, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like muffled crying or whimpering. The sounds were faint, almost dismissible as settling wood or wind through the walls, but they followed patterns suggesting deliberate activity rather than natural phenomena. When Thomas finally asked about the noises, Hawthorne explained that he was working on maps to guide me back home when spring arrives, and journals to record the wisdom he had learned during his time among their people. He showed Thomas elaborate drawings on what looked like treated animal hide, marked with symbols and route notations that made no sense to anyone in Milbrook. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing topographical features, weather patterns, and travel routes through terrain far more extensive than anything visible from Milbrook. But the maps told a disturbing story for anyone who looked closely enough. They detailed every path through the surrounding mountains, every cave and shelter, every place where a person might take refuge during a storm. More troubling still, they included notations in a language no townspeople could read, marking certain locations with symbols that looked disturbingly like tally marks. Some areas were marked with what appeared to be numbers, suggesting Hawthorne was keeping count of something, or someone. Dr. Putnam, whose curiosity had evolved into genuine suspicion, began keeping his own detailed notes on Hawthorne's behavior and the effects of his treatments on the townspeople. What he documented would later become crucial evidence in understanding the true nature of what was happening in Milbrook. The first disturbing pattern Putnam noticed was in the way Hawthorne's patients responded to his treatments. While the immediate effects were invariably positive, symptoms disappeared, strength returned, overall health improved dramatically, subtle changes in behavior became apparent over time. Patients treated by Hawthorne began to crave meat with an intensity that seemed unusual, especially given the limited protein available during the harsh winter. They displayed increased aggression and territorial behavior, becoming protective of their food stores in ways that went beyond normal rationing instincts. More troubling were the psychological changes. Several patients began experiencing similar nightmares, walking through snowy landscapes populated by shadowy figures who offered sustenance in exchange for joining their eternal feast. These dreams were so vivid and consistent across multiple patients that Putnam began to suspect some form of shared psychological influence, possibly through ingredients in Hawthorne's medicines that affected brain function. The breaking point in Dr. Putnam's growing suspicions came when he decided to analyze one of Hawthorne's medicine preparations using techniques he had learned during his medical training in Boston. Using a microscope he kept for examining tissue samples, Putnam discovered what appeared to be human hair and bone fragments in a powder that Hawthorne claimed was made from ground antler and medicinal roots. When confronted with this evidence, Hawthorne's reaction was swift and chilling. Rather than denying the findings or expressing surprise, he seemed pleased that Putnam had been observant enough to make the discovery. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes gleaming with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "I had hoped someone in this community would possess the intelligence to understand the true nature of my work." "Yes, you are correct in your analysis. The most effective medicines are those that incorporate elements from the ultimate source of life, human beings themselves." Putnam's blood ran cold as Hawthorne continued. "In my homeland," he said, "we learned long ago that the human body contains all the elements necessary to heal and strengthen other human bodies. When prepared properly, according to sacred traditions passed down through generations of true healers, human tissue becomes the most powerful medicine available. It creates a bond between those who share in its consumption, a communion that goes far deeper than anything your Christian sacraments could achieve." The implications hit Putnam like a physical blow. Not only was this man feeding human remains to the townspeople as medicine, but he was deliberately conditioning them to accept cannibalism as normal, even beneficial. The nightmares, the behavioral changes, the cravings, all were part of a systematic plan to break down the psychological barriers of civilized people. As February melted into March, Milbrook's situation grew increasingly dark and complex. Samuel Hawthorne's medical successes continued to mount, but so did strange incidents and unsettling discoveries surrounding his presence. Dr. Putnam kept detailed notes on his mysterious colleague's methods, partly out of medical curiosity, and partly due to growing suspicion that something profoundly disturbing was happening under the guise of healing. Hawthorne's medical kit contained instruments that Putnam had never seen in textbooks or surgical manuals, scalpels with unusual curved blades designed more for butchery than surgery, small saws with teeth arranged for cutting through bone rather than performing delicate operations, and various bottles of powders and liquids emitting odors unlike any known pharmaceutical preparations. When Putnam attempted to examine these substances, hoping to understand their composition, Hawthorne deflected with elaborate explanations about family secrets, sacred knowledge, and traditions that lost power when shared with the uninitiated. The breakthrough in understanding Hawthorne's true nature came from young Timothy Prescott, the boy who had first spotted the stranger emerging from the blizzard. While exploring the woods behind the Thornberry house, Timothy stumbled upon what he first thought was an animal's den, or perhaps a cave-in from an old mine shaft. The opening was partially concealed by fallen logs and snow, nearly invisible unless viewed from the right angle. But as Timothy investigated, clearing debris to see how deep the depression went, he realized someone had been using the space as a carefully organized storage site. The opening led to a natural chamber in the hillside, expanded and modified to create a sophisticated cache for preserving materials and supplies. The walls were lined with what appeared to be treated animal hides, unlike anything Timothy had seen local hunters produce. Inside this hidden repository were items that made Timothy's blood run cold. His hands shook as he unwrapped bundle after bundle, revealing evidence pointing to something far more sinister than anyone in Milbrook had imagined. There were clothes, men's work shirts, women's dresses, children's winter coats, carefully folded and preserved, but damaged in ways suggesting they had been cut away from their owners rather than discarded. Some bore dark stains that Timothy instinctively recognized as blood. The clothing represented styles from different regions and time periods, suggesting the collection had been amassed over years. More disturbing were the personal items: wedding rings, pocket watches, women's jewelry, children's toys, family photographs, religious objects like crosses and prayer books, dozens of cherished items, all meticulously cleaned and organized as if trophies preserved for a specific purpose. But what truly terrified Timothy were the anatomical sketches wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. They depicted the human body in ways designed for butchery rather than healing. The drawings included careful notations on optimal cutting points for maximum yield, preservation methods for long-term storage, and preparation techniques for various forms of consumption. Some sketches showed techniques for processing large game, deer, elk, bear, with detailed instructions. Others depicted human forms with similar notations, treating human bodies as simply another source of protein to be harvested. The clinical precision of the drawing suggested that their creator had extensive hands-on experience. Timothy ran home to tell his father, who initially dismissed the story as winter fever, brought on by too many ghost stories around the fire. But Jeremiah Prescott, a practical man, trusted his son's observations. When Timothy led him to the cache, even Jeremiah could not explain what they had discovered. The most chilling find was a journal written in the same careful hand as Hawthorne's maps. Entries dated over 3 years described expeditions into the mountains and encounters with traveling parties and isolated families. The journal detailed these encounters with clinical precision, describing the author's growing expertise in field preservation of resources and maintaining supplies during extended isolation. As Jeremiah read, a horrifying pattern emerged. The journal described a systematic process of stalking and trapping travelers, particularly vulnerable families or small groups. The author had developed sophisticated techniques for approaching potential victims under the guise of assistance, then isolating them in locations where they could be killed and processed without risk of discovery. One entry, dated nearly 18 months before Hawthorne's arrival in Milbrook, described an encounter with a family of 5 traveling to Albany for the father's work as a mill supervisor. The journal detailed how the author offered to guide them through a mountain pass, saving several days of travel, only to lead them into a trap during a storm. What followed in the journal was described with the clinical precision of a medical procedure, detailing how each family member had been killed and their bodies processed for meat and other useful materials. The entries made one thing horrifyingly clear: this wasn't random violence, or simple murder for robbery. It was a calculated system for obtaining human flesh, for consumption, and for the medicines Hawthorne had been administering to the people of Milbrook. The author described human meat as the most nutritionally complete protein available, and detailed methods for preserving and preparing it for both immediate consumption and long-term storage. Most disturbing were the entries about the psychological effects of consuming human flesh, both on the author and on others gradually introduced to the practice. The journal documented a systematic process for breaking down normal human revulsion to cannibalism, starting with small amounts mixed into other foods and medicines, then gradually increasing the proportion until the subject consumed pure human tissue without realizing it. According to the journal, this process created psychological changes, making subjects more susceptible to suggestion and more willing to participate in acts they would normally find abhorrent. The author had apparently used this technique in previous communities, turning ordinary people into willing accomplices in his cannibalistic practices. As Jeremiah Prescott finished reading the most recent entries, he realized with mounting horror that everything described in the journal was currently being implemented in Milbrook. Hawthorne wasn't just feeding the townspeople human flesh, he was systematically converting them into a community of willing cannibals, accomplices in his ongoing campaign of murder and consumption. Armed with this evidence, Prescott faced an impossible decision. The man who had saved his neighbors' lives, who had pulled Milbrook back from the brink during the worst winter in living memory, was something far more monstrous than anyone could have imagined. How could he accuse the town's savior of being a serial killer and cannibal? Especially when people were still recovering from the illnesses Hawthorne had cured, and when his treatments continued to keep the community healthy despite the harsh conditions. The evidence was overwhelming, but Prescott realized that simply presenting the journal and sketches to the townspeople might not convince them. Hawthorne had built enormous trust and goodwill. People saw him as a miracle worker, a man sent by Providence to save them. They might dismiss the evidence as fabricated, especially if Hawthorne offered a convincing alternative explanation. Prescott decided to confide first in Dr. Putnam, hoping the educated man might help him understand what they were dealing with, and develop a strategy to expose Hawthorne without causing panic, or allowing him to escape. Putnam's reaction was immediate and visceral. He had harbored his own suspicions about Hawthorne's methods for weeks, and Prescott's discovery confirmed his worst fears. Together, they began a more systematic investigation of Hawthorne's activities and influence in the community. Putnam pressed Hawthorne with pointed questions about his medical training, seeking specific details about where he had learned his techniques, and what authorities had validated them. Hawthorne's answers were always vague, filled with references to master healers in distant lands and sacred knowledge passed down through traditions that outsiders could not comprehend without proper initiation. When Putnam suggested documenting Hawthorne's techniques for the benefit of other doctors, potentially publishing their findings in medical journals to spread these treatments throughout New England, the stranger became visibly agitated. He insisted his methods were not meant for outside eyes, claiming that sharing them would strip them of healing power and cause great harm. Meanwhile, Prescott quietly began researching disappearances in the region over the past several years, using contacts among merchants and travelers in the mountain passes. What he discovered painted a terrifying pattern. Families traveling through the mountains had vanished with alarming frequency over the past 4 years. Hunting parties failed to return from routine expeditions. Lone travelers simply disappeared, leaving abandoned wagons or campsites. Most disappearances occurred during winter, when searches were nearly impossible. The pattern stretched back 7 years, moving systematically through Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. Each area experienced 2 to 3 year periods of mysterious disappearances, followed by the arrival of a helpful stranger with medical knowledge and survival skills, almost too conveniently. In Grafton, Vermont, in 1844, a healer named Samuel Hawthorne appeared during a diphtheria outbreak, saving dozens before disappearing in spring, along with several families who were supposedly relocating. In North Conway, New Hampshire, during the harsh winter of 1845, a man calling himself Samuel Blackthorne provided crucial aid during a food shortage, only to vanish when investigators asked questions about his methods. The pattern was identical: arrival during crisis, establishment of trust through effective treatment, gradual introduction of strange medicines and practices, and ultimately either conversion of the community to his philosophy or elimination of witnesses, followed by relocation to a new hunting ground. Dr. Putnam made his own disturbing discovery while analyzing Hawthorne's preserved medicines. Using chemical tests from his medical training, he confirmed the horrifying truth: the treatments contained not just human tissue, but tissue from multiple individuals, suggesting access to a large, systematic supply of human remains. Even more terrifying, the medicines were psychologically addictive. Compounds affected brain function, making patients crave continued treatment while becoming more susceptible to manipulation. The miraculous recoveries were not merely medical success, they were the product of a sophisticated system that created dependence while gradually eroding moral resistance. When Putnam confronted Hawthorne, the man's reaction was swift and chillingly casual. He did not deny the accusations. Instead, he seemed almost relieved. "You don't understand the necessities of true survival, Doctor," Hawthorne said, his pale eyes taking on a predatory gleam that made Putnam's blood run cold. "In the places I've been, in the situations I've faced, one learns that the boundaries between medicine and other necessities become meaningless when survival is at stake. The human body provides what the human body needs, if one has the knowledge and the will to use it properly." Hawthorne spoke with the calm precision of a professor lecturing eager students. "Your civilized society has created artificial taboos around the most natural and efficient forms of sustenance. My people learned long ago that these taboos are luxury attitudes, afforded only by the well-fed and weak. When winter comes, when food runs out, when death stalks every household, such squeamishness becomes not merely foolish, it becomes dangerous." Putnam left the conversation with a chilling realization: Samuel Hawthorne was not merely a killer. He was a cannibal who had honed his methods over years, using medical knowledge to justify and refine his practices, while converting entire communities to his twisted worldview. Milbrook began to change. Behavioral alterations appeared among the townspeople, matching Putnam's observations of Hawthorne's patients. Cravings for meat intensified, families reported members rising in the night to eat raw protein. Children played violent games, describing butchering and preparation in unsettling detail. Adults hoarded personal items from the dead under the guise of preserving their spirits, yet their possessiveness seemed more predatory than sentimental. Even strangers were not safe. When a lost traveler stumbled into Milbrook during a March snowstorm, residents observed him with the cold, calculated focus of wolves sizing up prey, as Dr. Putnam would later note in his journal. The breaking point came with Grace Thornberry's youngest daughter, Mary. The 8-year-old developed an insatiable hunger for meat, specifically raw meat, and began having vivid nightmares of hungry people in the snow, eager to share their feast and teach her the old ways. Grace found Mary in the cellar at midnight, gnawing on a raw piece of salted pork. Her hands and face were smeared with blood and grease. When Grace tried to take the meat away, Mary growled, truly growled like a wild animal, baring her teeth in defiance. Her eyes held the same pale, predatory gleam that had become synonymous with Hawthorne's converts. When she spoke, her words mirrored his unsettling cadence. "The teacher says," Mary said, licking her bloody fingers, "we must learn to eat what the mountain provides. He says the old people were wrong to waste good food just because it came from 2 legs instead of 4. He says when we learn the right way to eat, we will never be hungry again, and never fear the winter." Grace's horror was complete. Her daughter had been conditioned to see cannibalism not as a taboo, but as a virtue, a necessity for survival. And the conditioning was spreading throughout the town under the guise of medicine and survival education. That same night, Thomas Thornbury discovered Hawthorne in the family barn, working by candlelight over a large piece of meat on the workbench. At first, Thomas thought it was livestock, but a sickening certainty struck him: the cuts were human. Hawthorne's surgical tools gleamed as he separated different cuts and wrapped them in treated cloth for preservation. Containers of organs and body parts were carefully labeled with symbols matching those in his journal. Hawthorne noticed Thomas. He did not flinch. He smiled. "Ah, Thomas," he said calmly. "Perfect timing. I was hoping someone in the family would take interest in learning these techniques. Your children are showing remarkable progress. It will be beneficial for you to understand the practical aspects of what we are doing here." Thomas stood frozen, mind unable to process the scene. Hawthorne continued, speaking as though discussing ordinary farm chores. "This came from the traveler who passed through last week," he said, indicating the meat. "Poor fellow was already dying from exposure when I found him. Rather than let such valuable resources go to waste, I preserve what can benefit the community. The medicine I prepared for Mary included portions of this tissue. That is why her recovery was so complete." Thomas's horror struck like a physical blow. Not only was Hawthorne processing human corpses for food and medicine, but he had been feeding human flesh to his own children under the guise of treatment. "You're feeding my family, human beings," Thomas whispered. "I'm feeding your family the most nutritious and spiritually powerful sustenance available," Hawthorne replied calmly. "In my homeland, the consumption of human flesh creates bonds far deeper than ordinary social relationships. Those who share in the sacred feast become part of an eternal community, transcending the ordinary boundaries of life and death." Hawthorne set down his tools and fixed Thomas with a pale, evangelical gaze. "Your family is being transformed, Thomas. Your children are being prepared for a life without fear of hunger, cold, or isolation. They are learning to see the world as it truly is, a place where the strong survive by consuming the weak, where waste is the only sin, and every death offers an opportunity for continued life." The horror in Milbrook escalated beyond imagination. Children disappeared for hours, returning with bloodied clothes and secretive expressions. Families discovered hidden human remains in cellars and barns. The confrontation that would decide Milbrook's fate came on March 15, 1847, a night later remembered as the bloodiest in the town's history. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott, having gathered evidence and convinced Reverend Greenfield and other town leaders of Hawthorne's threat, planned to act. The plan was simple: quietly arrest Hawthorne and search his belongings for evidence to present to federal authorities. But the night promised to test the courage, morality, and sanity of every person in Milbrook. But Hawthorne had been watching the community's leaders just as carefully as they had been watching him. When the group of 6 men, Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornberry, innkeeper Joshua Foriski, Abigail's brother-in-law, who had arrived from Bennington the week before, and town constable Marcus Hartwell, approached the Thornberry house that evening, they found the scene transformed into something from their worst nightmares. The house was eerily quiet, but candlelight flickered from every window, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move with deliberate purpose, too quiet for a household that should have contained a family of 5, plus their mysterious guest. The silence was broken only by a low, rhythmic sound that none of them could immediately identify, something between singing and chanting, with a cadence that seemed to match the beating of a human heart. Thomas Thornberry met them at the door, but the man who greeted them was no longer the hard-working farmer they had known for years. Something was wrong with his eyes. They held the same vacant, predatory expression they'd learned to recognize in all of Hawthorne's most devoted followers, but intensified to a degree that made him seem barely human. His movements were fluid and coordinated, like a predator stalking prey, and his smile revealed teeth that seemed somehow sharper than they should have been. Behind him, Grace Thornberry stood motionless in the hallway, her hands stained with what looked like blood, her once neat dress torn and stained with substances that the men didn't want to identify. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her face wore an expression of beatific calm that was somehow more terrifying than outright madness would have been. "Samuel has been teaching us about true survival," Thomas said, in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. The words carried Hawthorne's distinctive accent and cadence, as if Thomas was reciting lessons he had memorized about the communion that binds communities together in the deepest winter, and the sacred responsibilities that come with understanding the real nature of sustenance. "Would you like to learn?" Dr. Putnam pushed past Thomas, his medical training overriding his fear, as he tried to understand what had happened to the Thornberry family. What he found inside the house was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life, a nightmare that combined religious ritual with butchery, in ways that challenged his understanding of what human beings were capable of becoming. The furniture had been rearranged to create what looked like a primitive altar in the center of the main room. The Thornberrys' dining table had been moved to serve as the focal point, surrounded by chairs arranged in a perfect circle. Around this makeshift altar, the remaining members of the Thornberry family sat motionless: Grace, 12-year-old Sarah, 8-year-old Mary, and 5-year-old William, along with several neighbors who had supposedly gone home hours earlier, but who now sat with the same empty, predatory expressions worn by Thomas and Grace. In the center of the circle, Samuel Hawthorne knelt beside the dining table, which had been covered with a white cloth that was now soaked with dark stains. On it lay what Dr. Putnam initially thought was a large piece of butchered livestock. But, as his eyes adjusted to the candlelight, he realized with sick certainty that the remains were human. The body had been systematically dismembered with surgical precision, different cuts separated and arranged as if for some grotesque feast. Around the table were various containers holding what appeared to be organs and other body parts, all carefully prepared and labeled with the same symbols that had appeared in Hawthorne's journal. The clinical precision of the butchery, combined with the ritualistic arrangement of the scene, suggested that this wasn't random violence, but part of a carefully planned ceremony. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said, without looking up from his work, his voice carrying the same calm, measured tone he had always used when discussing medical procedures. "Perfect timing. We were just conducting the final stage of young Mary's initiation into the deeper mysteries of survival. You see, the theoretical knowledge can only take one so far. True understanding requires direct participation in the sacred feast." Hawthorne stood slowly, his surgical tools gleaming in the candlelight like implements of some ancient religious ceremony. "The families that disappeared in the mountains didn't die of cold or starvation, Doctor. They became part of something much larger and more meaningful. They contributed to the survival of someone who could use their resources more efficiently than they ever could have managed on their own." Dr. Putnam realized, with growing horror, that everyone in the room was staring at him and his companions with barely controlled hunger, their eyes tracking every movement with the focused attention of predators evaluating potential prey. Whatever Hawthorne had been feeding these people, whatever psychological conditioning he had been implementing through his medicines and teachings, had transformed them at a fundamental level that went far beyond simple mental influence. "You've been drugging them," Putnam whispered, his voice barely audible in the candlelit room, "conditioning them chemically and psychologically to accept necessity." Hawthorne interrupted, his voice taking on the fervent tone of a preacher delivering a sermon to devoted followers: "To embrace the truth that your civilized society has spent centuries trying to deny, that survival requires the strong to consume the weak, that waste is the greatest sin, and that the human body provides the most perfect sustenance for human life." Hawthorne gestured toward the arranged body parts with obvious pride in his work. "In my homeland, which exists wherever winter is coldest and resources are scarcest, we learned that human fellowship requires sacrifice. The many sustain the few who are capable of leading them through the darkest times. These people have been transformed from weak, fearful creatures into something stronger, more unified, more capable of surviving whatever this harsh world can inflict upon them. Reverend Greenfield, who had remained silent until that moment, suddenly found his voice, as the full horror of what he was witnessing penetrated his shock. "You're talking about cannibalism, about murder, about turning these people into monsters like yourself, abandoning every principle that separates human beings from wild beasts." Hawthorne's laugh was the most chilling sound any of them had ever heard, not the laugh of a madman, but the genuinely amused response of someone who found their ignorance more pitiable than offensive. "Monsters, Reverend, look around you carefully. These people are healthier than they've been all winter. Their children are growing strong, and learning skills that will serve them for life. Their families are unified in purpose in ways that your empty promises of heavenly reward could never achieve. I've given them something infinitely more valuable than your abstract moral principles. I've given them the tools, and the mindset, to survive anything this world can inflict upon them." The confrontation that followed was swift, brutal, and unlike anything the men of Milbrook had ever experienced. Hawthorne's converts attacked the intruders with savage coordination, moving like a pack of predators who had hunted together many times before. Their movements were fluid and practiced, suggesting that this wasn't the first time they had been called upon to defend their transformed community against outside interference. Thomas Thornbury moved with inhuman speed, his farm-strengthened hands becoming claws that raked across Constable Hartwell's face before the man could draw his weapon. Grace Thornbury produced a butcher's knife from somewhere in her blood-stained dress, and advanced on Reverend Greenfield with the focused determination of someone who had been trained for exactly this situation. Most horrifying of all were the children. Sarah, Mary, and William Thornbury attacked with coordination that spoke of extensive training, their small size allowing them to move underneath the men's defenses, while their complete lack of fear or hesitation made them far more dangerous than their age would suggest. They had been transformed into something that was no longer quite human, retaining their childish appearance while gaining the predatory instincts of natural killers. Dr. Putnam found himself fighting for his life against people he had known and treated for years, people whose children he had delivered, and whose ailments he had cured. But the individuals attacking him bore only physical resemblance to the farmers and families he had called neighbors. Their personalities, their moral frameworks, their fundamental understanding of right and wrong had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt, according to Samuel Hawthorne's twisted philosophy. The battle was desperate and chaotic, fought with farm tools, kitchen knives, and bare hands in the confined space of the Thornbury house. The converts fought with the desperate ferocity of people defending not just their lives, but their entire worldview. Meanwhile, the town leaders fought with the desperation of men who understood that failure meant not just death, but the complete corruption of everything they held sacred. Dr. Barr Putnam barely escaped, carrying word of the horror to the rest of Milbrook, while bleeding from multiple wounds and haunted by images that would never leave his memory. Joshua Foresk managed to reach his horse and ride toward Bennington, to bring help from outside authorities, though he would never make it to his destination. The others, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornbury, and Constable Hartwell, disappeared into the nightmare that the Thornbury house had become. By dawn, half the remaining population of Milbrook was mobilizing to end Samuel Hawthorne's reign of terror. But they were no longer fighting a single deranged individual. They were facing an organized community of converts, who had been systematically prepared for exactly this confrontation, and who regarded the approaching townspeople not as neighbors trying to save them, but as enemies threatening everything they had learned to value. The siege of the Thornbury house lasted 3 days and nights, becoming a nightmare of urban warfare, fought between former neighbors who no longer recognized each other as human beings. The unconverted townspeople, led by Dr. Putnam and a few other community leaders who had escaped Hawthorne's initial trap, found themselves fighting not just for their lives, but for the soul of their community, against people they had known and trusted for years. Samuel Hawthorne had prepared for this eventuality with characteristic thoroughness. The house had been fortified with barricades and defensive positions that suggested months of planning. The converts had stockpiled weapons, food, and medical supplies that would allow them to withstand an extended siege. Most disturbing of all, they fought with coordination and tactical knowledge that indicated extensive training in organized violence. The unconverted townspeople quickly realized they were outmatched. Hawthorne's followers moved through the house and surrounding buildings with the fluid coordination of soldiers who had drilled together extensively. They used the terrain to their advantage, employing ambush tactics and psychological warfare that broke down the attackers' morale as much as their numbers. But perhaps the most effective weapon in Hawthorne's arsenal was the converts themselves. Seeing their former neighbors, friends, and family members transformed into predatory creatures, willing to kill and cannibalize anyone who opposed them, had a devastating psychological effect on the attacking townspeople. Many simply couldn't bring themselves to use lethal force against people they had known since childhood, even when those people were trying to kill them. Dr. Putnam documented the siege in journal entries that provide the most detailed account of what experts now consider one of the most successful examples of mass psychological conversion in American history. His writings describe the heartbreaking moments when fathers found themselves fighting their own children, when wives faced husbands across barricades, when the fundamental bonds of community and family were revealed to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. On the morning of the third day, the siege ended not with victory for either side, but with the complete disappearance of Samuel Hawthorne and his most devoted followers. When the exhausted townspeople finally broke through the house's defenses, they found it empty, except for evidence of hasty preparation for departure. Hawthorne and his converts had vanished into the mountains, taking with them supplies, weapons, and preserved food that would allow them to survive indefinitely in the wilderness. The aftermath of Samuel Hawthorne's departure left Milbrook a broken community that would never recover from what it had experienced. Of the 43 people who had fallen under his influence to varying degrees, only 12 were ever seen again. They trickled back to town over the following weeks and months, hollow-eyed and refusing to speak about what they had experienced in the mountains with their former teacher. Most of these survivors left Milbrook within a year, unable to bear the memories or the suspicious looks of their former neighbors, who could never be entirely certain that the conversion process had been reversed. Some moved to distant cities, where they could start over with new identities. Others simply disappeared into the American frontier, perhaps seeking communities where their changed perspectives and unusual skills would be less conspicuous. Dr. Putnam spent the remaining years of his life documenting everything he could remember about Hawthorne's methods, teachings, and the systematic process by which an ordinary community had been transformed into a cannibalistic cult. His journals, preserved in the Vermont Historical Society's restricted archives, provide the most detailed account of what experts now believe was one of America's first recorded cases of mass psychological conditioning used to override fundamental moral taboos. The physical evidence was damning enough. When spring arrived and the snows melted, search parties found multiple cache sites throughout the mountains, containing preserved human remains and personal effects from dozens of missing persons spanning several years. The scale of Hawthorne's activities became clear. He had been operating throughout New England for at least a decade, preying on travelers and isolated families while perfecting his methods of psychological manipulation and human preservation. The cache sites revealed the sophisticated nature of Hawthorne's operation. He had established permanent supply depots throughout the mountain wilderness, each containing equipment for butchering, preserving, and storing human flesh, along with chemical supplies for producing the medicines he used to condition his victims. The organization and scale of these installations suggested that Hawthorne was not working alone, but was part of a larger network of individuals engaged in similar activities throughout the northeastern wilderness. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came in late April, when a hunter found what appeared to be a permanent settlement deep in the mountains, far from any established trails or settlements. The site included sophisticated food preservation equipment, medical instruments of unusual design, workshops for producing the strange tools and clothing that Hawthorne had carried, and detailed journals documenting his experiments in what he called survival psychology. These journals revealed that his activities in Milbrook weren't random predation, or even simple cannibalism driven by hunger or madness. They were part of a carefully planned and methodically executed experiment in creating self-sustaining communities, based on what Hawthorne described as post-civilizational survival protocols. His ultimate goal was apparently to develop techniques for maintaining human communities during extended periods of societal collapse, using methods that abandoned conventional moral constraints in favor of pure survival efficiency. The journals described similar experiments conducted in other isolated communities throughout New England over a period of nearly 15 years, each following the same basic pattern: infiltration during times of crisis, establishment of trust through genuine medical assistance, and gradual introduction of unconventional survival practices, systematic psychological conditioning to overcome moral resistance, and finally either complete conversion of the community or elimination of witnesses, followed by relocation to a new testing ground. Most chilling of all were the detailed entries describing Hawthorne's long-term plans for expanding his operations. He had identified dozens of vulnerable communities throughout the northeastern mountains, and had developed comprehensive strategies for infiltrating and converting each one. His ultimate vision appeared to be the creation of a network of cannibalistic communities that could support each other through the harshest winters and most severe societal disruptions, gradually spreading his philosophy throughout the isolated regions of New England, and eventually beyond. The journals also revealed that Hawthorne was not the architect of this system, but rather a field operative working for what appeared to be a larger organization, dedicated to developing and testing survival strategies for anticipated societal collapse. References to the council and the directors suggested that his work was being monitored and guided by individuals with extensive resources and long-term planning capabilities. Samuel Hawthorne himself was never captured, despite extensive searches by local authorities, federal marshals, and military units deployed specifically to hunt down what officials privately referred to as the Milbrook incident. No trace of him was found after his departure from the town, leading to widespread speculation about his fate and whereabouts. Some investigators theorized that he had died in the wilderness, unable to survive without the support structure he had built in Milbrook. Others believed he had simply moved on to a new region, ready to begin his horrific work again in a place where no one would recognize his methods or connect him to previous incidents. The truth may be more disturbing than either theory suggests. In 1851, just 4 years after the Milbrook incident, reports began surfacing from isolated communities in northern Maine of a helpful stranger who appeared during harsh winters, offering medical assistance and survival advice to struggling families. In 1854, similar reports came from remote areas of New Hampshire, describing a man with pale eyes and medical knowledge, who seemed to understand exactly what people needed to hear during their darkest moments. Each incident followed the same pattern that had devastated Milbrook: arrival during a crisis, establishment of trust through effective medical treatment, gradual introduction of unconventional practices, and eventually either complete conversion of the target community or mysterious disappearances, followed by the stranger's departure. The last confirmed sighting of someone matching Hawthorne's description came in 1859, in a mining camp in northern Michigan, where desperate conditions during an unusually brutal winter had left the miners vulnerable to anyone offering hope and assistance. Witnesses described a man with pale eyes and prematurely white-streaked hair, who claimed to come from distant lands beyond the great forests, where the old ways of survival are still honored. He stayed for 3 months, helping the miners survive conditions that had already killed several of their number. His medicines were remarkably effective. His advice about food preservation and rationing kept the camp supplied through the worst of the winter, and his leadership helped maintain morale during weeks when the temperature never rose above zero. When spring arrived, and the mining company's supply wagons finally reached the camp, Hawthorne had vanished, taking with him 12 members of the mining community who were never seen again. The mining company's records, discovered decades later during research into industrial accidents of the 1850s, included disturbing details about the condition of the camp when the supply wagons arrived. The remaining miners displayed behavioral changes consistent with those observed in Milbrook survivors: obsessive hoarding of food, unusual dietary preferences involving raw meat, and social dynamics that suggested the community had developed hierarchical structures based on principles very different from conventional mining camp organization. Dr. Putnam's final journal entry, written shortly before his death from pneumonia in 1863, contained a warning that has haunted researchers and law enforcement officials for over a century. The man we knew as Samuel Hawthorne understood something about human nature that civilized people prefer to ignore, that under the right conditions, with the proper techniques and sufficient patience, anyone can be convinced that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but necessary for survival. He didn't create monsters from ordinary people, he revealed the monsters that already existed within them, waiting for permission to emerge. Putnam's warning proved prophetic in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The American Civil War, which began just 14 years after the Milbrook incident, provided numerous examples of ordinary citizens committing atrocities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The industrial disasters and social upheavals of the late 19th century repeatedly demonstrated how quickly civilized communities could descend into savage competition for resources, when survival became the primary concern. Modern psychological research has confirmed many of Dr. Putnam's observations about the techniques Samuel Hawthorne used to convert an entire community to his twisted worldview. Studies of cult indoctrination, military conditioning, and survival psychology have identified the same basic principles that Hawthorne applied with such devastating effectiveness: gradual introduction of extreme concepts, creation of dependency relationships, isolation from alternative viewpoints, and systematic breaking down of moral boundaries through incremental steps that each seem reasonable in context. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors in human history often come not from supernatural forces or random violence, but from the systematic exploitation of human psychology by individuals who understand how to manipulate our deepest instincts and most fundamental needs. The story of Samuel Hawthorne reminds us that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, and that the line between healer and destroyer, between teacher and corrupter, can disappear entirely when survival becomes the only virtue that matters. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or could there be more to Samuel Hawthorne's true identity, and the organization he apparently served? Leave your comment below, and share your theories about what really drove this man to such extremes, and whether his network of survival communities might still exist in remote areas of our country. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's hidden history, and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries.